Great.
Wow.
Awesome.
Cool.
Okay, great. So thank you guys so much for being here. And as a quick introduction, Liam and Dave, since I extended that invite to you guys as well. So this is a group of several descendants of Brigham Young, and this kind of group that has come together has been working on reconciliation efforts and trying to become more informed and tackle head-on topics that are on the topic of race and the kind of historical harms and things like that, especially uncovering stories that we growing up in the church might not have been familiar with. And so tonight I asked for the opportunity to talk a little bit more about my exposure to better understanding my family history. And that what I'll be talking about is my third great grandfather, Abraham Owen Smoot. And so that's a picture up here on the screen with him. That is his actual signature, which is actually shocking to uncover because it looks very, very similar to my own. And really, I grew up like a lot of people where I had heard the really good stories about my family history. And there are a lot of admirable stories that I still to this day very much admire and get a lot of value out of. But at the same time, my approach to this topic is with the intent of doing my best to follow President Oak's declaration that members should be rooting out racism from within the Church of Jesus Christ. And then, of course, this is my own personal integrity of simply wanting to know the full truth of our history and the world around me and better understanding the impact and the reality of the history that I've grown up to, because a lot of this is still inherited and still impacts us to this day. I'm still ignorant about a lot of things. And in fact, if there's anything that I say here, if anyone knows better, by all means, speak up and let me know. But this is me piecing together as much as I could. And the funny thing is, growing up in our family, which is very tightly knit together, we had a lot of exposure to family history, is that every member of my family had received one of these books, which is the Abraham Owen Smoot, A Testament of His Life, which was a collection of the entirety story as we knew it of Abraham Owen Smoot. And I remembered doing many presentations on Abraham Owen Smoot when I was growing up. In like the fourth grade, I was supposed to give a presentation in my classroom about one of my ancestors. And I always chose Abraham Owen Smoot because there's so many fun and interesting facts about him. And I tried to remember what that was, and I literally went back and opened my book, and I found my mom's handwriting, and this is my third grade presentation that I had of him. And so I know exactly the story that I knew about him. And there's a lot of, like I said, really interesting facts and things that I would always be very proud of in sharing my ancestry. And so today I'll kind of tell some of the most remarkable traits and aspects of Abraham's story. But I'm also then going to intentionally talk about the things that have been unearthed in the last several years through the work of historians, and then try to talk about how I face that and how I think that members in general and just broader community, we should face these things and talk about them more head on. I think there's a lot of good in doing that. So just as a quick outline of the story of Abraham, Abraham Owen Smoot was born in 1815 in Owenton, Kentucky, just on the American frontier. His early life was shaped by, the loss of his father, hardship with his health, and he had this kind of growing curiosity for reading, which was what drove him to self-education. His mother was first visited by two missionaries in 1835 and joined the church, and that is what led Abraham to joining just a few weeks later, I believe, followed right after her baptism. And so he was baptized in the church in 1835 at the age of 20, and almost immediately was thrust into leadership. He was ordained a deacon just a few weeks after and was almost immediately appointed a branch leader for a local congregation of saints. And what really stands out in the early years of Abraham in kind of the historical record is that he had a very intense upbringing. He was described as being resolute and confident and unwavering. He thoroughly believed in the restoration, and most notably here, he formed a very close friendship with Wilford Woodruff. The two actually served together as missionaries in Kentucky and Tennessee. And if any of you have seen the classic Legacy film that we all grew up with, there's actually a scene where you'll see there Elder Woodruff there's two missionaries, they're walking over the hill, and Elder Woodruff is depicted at the top, and he calls back to Elder Smoot. And that is both Abraham and Wilford being depicted as arriving to Kirtland to see the Kirtland Temple, because they then were arriving back from their missions to attend the School of the Prophets. So this friendship between Wilford Woodruff and Abraham ran pretty deep. In fact, Woodruff he later named one of his own sons Abraham Owen Woodruff after his mission companion, which I think was a signal of how highly he regarded Abraham's devotion and character. Throughout his life, Abraham served 9 proselyting missions across the southern states and even into England, many of which were actually callings extended by the prophet Joseph Smith himself. And so this is the Abraham Smoot that people, I think, first learned to admire. There was earnestness, fearlessness. He's fully committed to what he believed God had called him to do. And so in 1838, Abraham embarked on a 5-month proselyting mission in the southern states, Missouri and Arkansas. And when he returned to far west was when he witnessed the Missouri State Militia invading in on the Saints. And he, alongside Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith, were taken prisoner during the Mormon War, the Mormon-Missouri War. And it was, in fact, at this time that he first was married to his wife, Margaret McMeans. She was a widow. He had started writing her on his mission, and she had a son, William, that Abraham would later adopt. And then eventually, after the Nauvoo days, Abraham would, of course, participate in polygamy. And so he'd be sealed to 5 other women. He'd have 24 biological children throughout his life, and he also adopted several children from previous marriages there. But what Abraham witnessed, he witnessed a lot, actually, in the early days of the church. There was the construction, dedication of the Kirtland Temple, the harmful expulsion that happened in Missouri, and the Saints' exodus from Nauvoo. And throughout these years, he served several missions in the South. He campaigned for Joseph's presidential platform, and he even helped a lot of the earliest families voyage over from England using the church's the Perpetual Immigration Fund. He led branches and set on high councils. He faithfully heeded the call to migrate over to west with the church's expulsion from Illinois, which included him leading a company himself that had over 100 families, bringing them into the Salt Lake Valley. And so in Utah, that Abraham's commitment seems to have, his ability to serve among the saints really seems to have taken hold. He first helped several companies arrive into the Salt Lake Valley, and then he set up residence in the Sugar House area of Salt Lake City. He was then called as a bishop. He was appointed a territorial legislator, and then he was the second mayor of Salt Lake City. He was elected the second mayor in Salt Lake, and he served as mayor there for nearly a decade, refused salary at that time, and often used a lot of his own wealth and property to fuel growth in the Salt Lake economy. And so Abraham clearly held a worldview that relied, I think, deeply in strict order, morality, and then hierarchy. He wasn't known for being a soft administrator. I think he was actually quite strict. And because of that, I think the Salt Lake community grew in industry. Obviously, there's other aspects there, but from the perspective that they're looking at, they're growing the Salt Lake community and industry. And I think these traits are what earned him the trust of Brigham Young at the time, who saw him as capable of creating structure and kind of riding out the communal chaos and bringing things together in that way. And so it was at this point in 1968 that Brigham Young asked Abraham to uproot his life and his family and move out to Provo, Utah. And the sense was that he was going to clean up what was considered kind of lawless, disorganized community. Again, this is from the perspective of white Latter-day Saints that are colonizing in the Utah territory. And now my family kind of has this lore that gives an account that when Abraham had asked, when Brigham Young had asked Abraham to move out to Provo, Abraham responded to Brigham's command by kind of saying, well, I'd much rather go to hell before I'd go to Provo. And Brigham purportedly kind of responded that with, well, that is your actual choice, Smoot. Like, you can go to Provo or you can go to hell. That's your choice. And that is, of course, a very Brigham Young kind of rhetoric kind of thing to do. But that's the kind of what comes out of the family lore, is this kind of thing. So, of course, Brigham sends him out. Abraham devoutly resettles in Provo. And then he was immediately called as the presiding stake president, and he was also appointed the mayor of Provo. And so you're seeing this kind of consolidation of power that happens both ecclesiastically as well as in legislation and in state power. So Abraham, according to Bess, as we kind of put the historical record back together, really threw himself into reform in Provo. He cracked down on a lot of what were considered the frontier vices like drunkenness, gambling, and tried to instill order and morality. And of course, it should be said, Abraham's sense of what constituted order and morality almost certainly came from Abraham's own upbringing that held kind of Southern views of the way things should be. And so it was under his leadership that Provo did begin to kind of experience a lot of growth in that community as the Saints started kind of building out the economy there. So he championed for new roads being constructed, oversaw the arrival of the Utah Southern Railroad, organized some industries of woolen mills, lumber yards, and founded one of the first banks in that area. To the point that in the 1870s, he was kind of known as the father of Utah Valley's development there for kind of his outsized role in building up Provo's infrastructure and economy. And then he oversaw the construction of what I have here, which is the Provo Tabernacle, which would, of course, later become the Provo City Center Temple, which is interesting because my brother several years ago got married in this temple, and I actually didn't know that connection there. So as the stake president, he pushed and encouraged a lot of members to donate so that they could build up this kind of tabernacle building. And so that's what we have today in Provo. And so after this, Abraham was appointed the first chair of the board of what became known as Brigham Young Academy. And this was probably the most difficult appointment that he had received in his life. And that's because establishing and growing this academy was very much an uphill battle financially for the Saints. And a lot of that weight was taken on by Abraham. So when the institution was faced with financial troubles, he personally mortgaged his own properties to keep the school alive. Then the academy's main facility, the Lewis building, burned down in a disastrous fire. And in response, Abraham immediately had classes moved to the upper floor of the bank that he owned, and then even made rooms available in his own home so that the classes could continue uninterrupted. When the funds ran dry, which happened on several occasions, he began paying the teachers directly out of his own pocket, again, to keep the academy going. And the reality is that without Abraham, there is no meaningful path of survival for the academy that would eventually grow and become the Brigham Young University that we have today. And so here's just a few pictures real quick. Here's the Lewis building. This was the main facility of Brigham Young Academy. Actually, in this picture right here, that's the Lewis building up there in the back left side. And then, of course, there was a big disastrous fire. Here's what was left of the Lewis building. And then nearing the end of his life, they reconstructed to replace the Lewis building. And this is the education building. It was dedicated in 1892. This was just a few years before Abraham's death. And as I understand, I think this is actually what's been converted to the Provo Library. I'm not that familiar with Provo, ironically. And so I think this is what it is. And then, of course, near the end of his life, after all of these things, he famously wrote a letter to one of his lives where he detailed and said that I haven't, there's like a piece of property that I haven't mortgaged. I've had to do it in order to keep Brigham Young Academy going. I would sooner lose all than to fail in fulfilling this responsibility. I love that school. It must live. And so right here, this is the story, and this is the version of Abraham Owen Smoot that has long been celebrated. This is what led to BYU naming the administration that was built in the 1960s after Abraham Owen Smoot. He was seen and portrayed as a visionary, sacrificial, and deeply committed disciple that championed education as a sacred cause. He actually thought that this was a sacred duty that he had, and he threw everything that he had in order to make sure that it continued. And of course, today it's quite literally hundreds of thousands of lives have been affected by, I think, Abraham's unwavering commitment to education for the Saints and his organization efforts in Provo, Utah. But then, of course, there's another aspect of Abraham Owen Smoot's life and legacy, and this has been the less publicized until recently. And it's the reality that despite many purported admirable traits that Abraham possessed and accomplished, he also was a slaveholder. And even further, I think that it appears that Abraham was a strong proponent of the racial restriction that first began to develop in the 1850s among Latter-day Saints. And that is the part of the story that I think also needs to be told and recognized if we're going to cheer and I mean, if we're going to tell the stories of Abraham Owen Smoot as part of my family tree, this is also an important aspect that I think needs to be told and reckoned with. From my own personal study, again, this is going from Joanna Brooks, Paul Reeves, a number of scholars have kind of focused in on this in the last several years, dating back to that 2015 is when I think kind of the most significant stuff with Paul's research, is that we know that there were at least 3, and actually recently when I was reading, possibly there were 4 Black individuals that were enslaved by Abraham and his household at some point during his life in Utah. As far as I can tell, and Liam, you could fix me on this, but as far as I can tell, he did not have slaves before then. His family had slaves, like his grandparents had been slaveholders back in the South prior to his conversion. He does not seem to have had any prior to coming to Utah, but in Utah, he was part of a group that were in favor of ensuring that there could be slaves in Utah, and was the proponent of making sure that there was legislation, territorial legislation that would allow for that. And then he participated in that. And his views of this does seem to have maybe kind of changed over time. I do want to speak specifically about these 4 individuals, but I think in context, Abraham's Southern upbringing clearly seems to have shaped and warped how Abraham's racial worldview was constructed. He seems to have inherited what would have been a traditional Southern attitude that viewed people of Black African-American descent as inferior. And when he served as a missionary in those Southern states in 1836 with Wilford Woodruff, he appears to have gone out of his way and made great lengths to assure Southern listeners that were listening to his message that the Saints were not abolitionists. And when the Saints settled in Utah, he seems to have shifted further toward being this pro-slavery ideology to ensure that there was Utah legislation that would allow Southern migrating companies and families to bring enslaved people into the territory. And then, like I said, he practiced and participated in this himself. In his upbringing, I think slavery kind of functioned as a type of social marker and a display of status and power. And he participated in what is a very harmful practice that treated human beings as if they were property. And then, like I said, furthermore, in 1879, he participated in a meeting with John Taylor in an investigation of the origin of the racial restriction. And from what we can extract from the details, his input appears to have helped solidify this false narrative about the origins of the temple and priesthood racial restriction ban of Black Latter-day Saints. And it's because of his testimony that Black Latter-day Saints continue to be subjected to this harmful and unnecessary marginalization that restricted their access to priesthood and temple blessings for more than a century. And that's incredibly heavy to deal with, of recognizing this figure that I had told about and was very proud of kind of his civil responsibilities and contributions, simultaneously created tremendous harm for marginalized group and for his fellow Latter-day Saints, simply because he subscribed to ideas that he likely was raised up with, but then made sure that it was baked into Latter-day Saint community and doctrine. So I just want to take a minute here and talk about everything that I can extract that we know about these 4 individuals. And so the first was Lucinda, who also went by Lucy, likely the first enslaved person acquired by Abraham Owen Smoot, as far as I can tell. Originally, she was enslaved by the Crosby family, which were members that had come from Mississippi. We have records that show that Abraham purchased in a transaction around 1850 and 1851. And then later, within a year or two, it looks like we have records of showing that Margaret Smoot, one of Abraham's wives, then sold Lucy in a transaction to Thomas Williams that happened in 1852 for $400. After slavery was abolished in 1862 and that applied to the Utah territory, it seems likely that Lucy then returned to the South, and then because, of course, there are very few records for Black Americans, the details of what happened to Lucy after that are really unknown. We haven't been able to uncover anything outside of that. We then have Alexander, Alex, and this was actually the one that I recently had learned about. Alex was born into slavery in 1837 to the Bankhead family. The Bankheads were members that had brought Alex over to Utah as part of a pioneer company. And if I recall correctly, it was the Heber C. Kimball Pioneer Company. And then there was a practice where families that would have enslaved people would then lend or hire out these Black members of the community. And so it seems that he was hired out to Abraham sometime in 1850. When Alex was freed, and after the abolition of slavery, which applied to the state of Utah, we have this interview where Alex actually talks about being owned by Abraham at some point. And so that's actually how we know that he comes into the picture, is he might have been hired out, but he referred to Abraham as being an owner. And so we know that after he was freed in 1880, he was living in Spanish Fork with his wife and stepson. But then later in 1897, Alex had attended what was the Pioneer Jubilee event. And at that, Abraham described Alex as being one of the whitest Negroes living, in the context of trying to use that as a reason for Alex's inclusion at the event, was trying to make it seem that, well, he's just so white, he's like the whitest Negro that we have, which is why he is welcomed here. And so I think it really does speak to the harmful rhetoric and racial views that had taken hold of the community in Utah at that time. And then two more, we have Thomas. Tom, this was one of the first ones that Paul had actually kind of raised attention to in 2019, and a lot of people focused and realized that A.O. Smoot of the admin building had been a slaveholder. Tom was born into slavery. He was enslaved by the Church family in Tennessee. He was brought over in 1857 in the Sugar House Ward while he was still enslaved. And then he was sold to Abraham in Sugar House while Abraham would have been bishop in that ward. And the records suggest that Tom actually had been baptized a member of the Church of Jesus Christ. And so this was what Paul referred to as deeply embarrassing, was the fact that Tom was a fellow Latter-day Saint. And we don't know the context of conversion, or if there's Tom didn't have freedom, and so you can't really know what Tom ultimately had wanted, but he attended the ward that he was in among his fellow Latter-day Saints, with his bishop being his enslaver. And I think one of the most atrocious things about this was that Tom never received freedom from his fellow Latter-day Saints, from his own bishop. He did not have his freedom granted to him. Freedom had to come through the federal government in order to grant them that freedom. And that should have come from actual Latter-day Saints that saw this as a fellow member that was sitting in the pews with them. And so we also know that Tom actually died just weeks before the abolition of slavery. And so he actually did not live to see his freedom. And like I said, Paul had kind of highlighted this when we uncovered that there was a record that Tom, a Negro, had died, and he was belonging to Bishop Smoot. And then the very last one is Jerry, or Jeremiah, who was enslaved by David Lewis, and they originally were from Kentucky. They brought him to Utah in 1851, and then Brigham Young, it seems Brigham Young came into the picture where he had encouraged the Lewis family to sell Jerry to a kind and faithful church member if she had chosen to sell him. And the records seem to suggest that he was sold to Mayor Smoot in the records there. So he was purchased by Smoot. There is no bill of sale that we've been able to survive, but that seems to suggest. And then Jerry actually had died prior to Abraham's movement to Provo. And so he was drowned in Mill Creek, and I don't know the circumstances of that. But these are the four individuals from the record that suggest that Abraham Owen Smoot not only was in favor of ensuring that slavery was acceptable in Utah, but then actually participated in buying, selling, and the trade and transactions of slavery. And the reason why I think this is deeply important, and I'll wrap up here, is that I think there are three ways that we can react to this. And in my own family, we're seeing the reactions, the different reactions that we can take in real time happening in my family tree. So the first is when Paul had actually made a publication about this, about the fact that Abraham Owen Smoot was a slaveholder. One of his descendants that was named directly by Abraham Owen McKay, was a freshman at BYU. He pushed efforts and made a publication trying to participate in making sure that the BYU building was renamed. And it was because he realized that there was an aspect of his family's history that he did not know or recognize, and he wanted to take some action that allowed his fellow students at BYU that were Black Latter-day Saints and Black students to know that this was a safe space for them, and to know that they could feel comfortable and that we could reconcile and try to create reparations for these kind of harmful acts that have affected these groups. And so he had called for the changing of the BYU administration building, and that was one of the first kind of reactions that came out of the family tree at this time. There then, of course, from within our family tree as well, many descendants that came together and had wrote a response letter to these kind of proposals of changing the name that really ended up kind of just digging our heels and saying, what is the point of renaming the Smoot building? This actually accomplishes nothing. And unfortunately, in the letter that was put out by the Abraham Owen Smoot organization, of which are events that I have gone to, is they tried to make an argument of saying, well, of course we denounce slavery, but it's impossible to understand enough of the context from 160 years ago to place judgment on these people's motives. They also, again, I think, just out of a lot of our ignorance on this topic, made several claims that historians just don't agree with, of saying that there's no point in smearing or canceling, and that they thought that there was evidence suggesting that Abraham Owen Smoot had given freedom to the people that he had enslaved, and that's just simply not true, and that there wasn't really going to be any change just by changing his name. And that's actually where I land, is saying that I disagree. I think that there are things that we can do, meaningful and symbolic things, that can make sure that people understand that we are facing and trying to reconcile with this history, and also making sure that everyone that stands on the campus at BYU can feel that they are welcome and feel like they are seen as equal, and feel that they can be seen as equal, not only in the eyes of God, which is our own doctrine and within our scripture, but also as a community, that we can make that space for everyone. And then the third is kind of what seems to have been taken place, where BYU did end up kind of sidestepping it by recently announcing that BYU is tearing down the administration building that had Abraham Owen Smoot's name, and they will be rebuilding it. But there's kind of a new practice where we don't name buildings at BYU by people now. So indirectly resolving the issue by having the building recompleted. But again, I feel like maybe this is sidestepping for my family and for my family tree of trying to make sure that we face the reality that we've told a very flattering story about one of our ancestors time and again, and celebrated that, and not really come to terms with the harm and Abraham's participation, not only in being a slaveholder, but also he played a pivotal role on cementing this narrative that the temple and priesthood ban, the racial restriction, originated from Joseph Smith, and that's just simply not true. This is something that developed later, and either through bias, through self-manipulation, or outright telling a lie, Abraham Smoot ensured that this continued on, and it created harm and caused there to be a rift among Black Latter-day Saints and their peers of the temple and priesthood blessings that exist within the Church of Jesus Christ. And so I think that it's important that recognizing that Abraham helped build institution and he shaped generations, but particular institutions and particular generations. He upheld systems that denied the humanity of others. And we can tell his story and honor the good without excusing the harm, but in fact, still making sure that we highlight and talk about that harm, so that Latter-day Saints and as a broader community, we can do better. And I think we should tell the whole story because I believe the truth is redemptive and healing. What my actual concern is and why I'm actually getting involved here is because my worry is that we just stop telling the stories altogether, that we just don't talk about Abraham Smoot because now there's unsavory things. And I think it is actually more important than ever that we do talk about these stories and we do let people know the messier picture. And because I think it's a more honest picture, and then we can see the people that we have inherited where we're at now from, and we can learn from that, and we can make sense of this complicated, messy world that we live in. I've said this before, and I'll kind of just say this again. I think that one of the best stories about the way that we deal with the complicated mess of what we've inherited from our ancestors came from Melissa Inouye, who was a great Latter-day Saint theologian. She unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but I was able to meet her shortly before that. And she had told this story about when she was going through chemotherapy, how there were times that her body would just kind of shut down and she would vomit onto the floor. And there was just this incredibly humbling moment where she had to rely on her husband to come and kind of pick her up and carry her over and then clean up that mess for her. She did not have the ability to be able to do it herself. And she related that very experience of saying that that's what she thinks our ancestors would want from us, from the other side of the veil, is the ability to recognize the mess and to clean it up and to make things right, rather than simply just avoiding it or pretending it doesn't happen. And so in closing, Abraham Smoot was by all accounts a man of intense faith and courage and charity in many ways. He made major contributions to the community of not just the community, but the church that are still felt today. I think that there are generations at BYU that benefited from the academy that he helped establish and preserve. And those are details of his life that I think are worthy of admiration. But Abraham Owen Smoot also enslaved human beings, and he later, perhaps unwittingly, lent his authority of codifying a discriminatory church policy and doctrine that marginalized Black members for over a century. And of course, I am using the word doctrine as something that was taught, not something that is true. It was not true, but it was baked into the fabric of the discussion and the rhetoric and views of Latter-day Saints. And I think these actions, however common in their era, inflicted real harm and pain that lingers into our own time. And today, as a new generation of Latter-day Saints, I think that we need and want to reckon with this legacy. There's the growing understanding of acknowledging the ugly parts of our history is not about tearing people down. It's about building a more just and compassionate foundation for our community. And I think Abraham's name coming off the building is not an erasure of history. I think it's an invitation to remember the history more honestly. And I think that we honor his faith and service while also frankly condemning racist beliefs and injustices that they perpetuated. And in doing so, I think we affirm to every BYU student and every member of the community that regardless of race, that they are valued, heard, and welcomed. We affirm, as the scriptures say, that all are alike unto God. This is something that Paul Reeve talks about frequently. And this principle, long neglected, can at last take priority among Latter-day Saints if we choose to face it. And so in the end, Abraham Owen Smoot is a cautionary tale and also a hopeful one. I think it reminds us that even sincere, strong disciples can be blind to great moral truths of their day, and that we must have the courage to confront those blind spots in retrospective. It reminds us of the power of redemption and change, that institutions can change, like the church instituted change in 1978 by, rightfully so, giving all members access to priesthood and the temple blessings. And perspectives can also change when we shine light on the truth. And so this is my hope, my commitment as a direct descendant of Abraham Owen Smoot. And I also hope that I see more of this among fellow Latter-day Saints. And so that's largely what my hope is, being engaged with this group here. And so that's my presentation, and I'll just end with that.
I think you verbalized that all so well. Just that was such a beautiful way of saying all of that. So thank you. Before I say anything or ask questions, does anybody have questions or comments? Yeah, Marion, go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to be a little cautious here because I don't want to be misunderstood. Austin, that was amazing. I appreciate your research. You're careful looking into all of the points of this. Let me just mention that beautiful big building that is now, you're correct, it's the Provo Library, was signed by Brigham Young's son, Joseph Don Carlos Young. So that's just for some of the relatives here. That's our grandfather. Now, I want to be careful with this, and please correct me or ask questions of me if it comes across incorrectly. Okay, so I feel an obligation here with this group because I have invited my beloved granddaughter to join us. I'm very much aware of how hard this is for her to hear these stories. I'm also really aware of some of the youth of the church that are leaving the church because of these hard stories. So just as a reminder, and this is mostly to Morgan, don't let imperfections derail you. I love how Sherry D talked about this. She says, does having this divinely inspired structure in place mean mistakes are never made in the Lord's church? Of course not. The Lord runs his church with mortals, and sometimes mortals make mistakes, and sometimes huge mistakes. Mistakes may be kind of mild with what we're seeing. Anyway, Elder Holland, when he was elder, said this, except in the case of his only perfect begotten son, imperfect people are all God has ever had to work with. That must be terribly frustrating to him. Can you imagine him looking at what his prophets have been doing? I can't imagine that. But he deals with it. So should we. And when you see imperfections, remember that the limitation is not the divinity of the work. So my hope is, as we uncover and talk about some of these ugly, ugly parts of history, which we have to also keep in mind presentism, where we put our values, place it back in history where their whole system was a little bit different, not justified, but different. That we take care that we have an inspired gospel of Jesus Christ, that we have mortals who do horrible things that sometimes that are doing the work.
Thank you, Marion.
Great, thank you.
Liam had his hand up first, but did you have anything to say?
Yes. First, I just wanted to say thank you for letting me attend this. I'm Austin's cousin. I'm a descendant of A.O. Smoot. I double dipped. My parents come from two different wives. My dad's from the third wife. My mom's from the fourth wife. But I'm really grateful to be here for this discussion, and I love what Marion said. I think one thing I've felt is when I see so many people struggling, I feel that it's not necessarily the stories, but it's the way that we have crafted so carefully the stories in which almost deifying our ancestors. And so when we see them as human, whether they're prophets or just our ancestors, I think that is what causes so much distress for people, because we've created a narrative in which they are not human and they weren't supposed to be the way we tell it historically, or in primary, or when my mom's a genealogist and she knew some of this stuff, but she kept most of this to herself because she was uncomfortable with it. And so I think so many of our generation, the younger generation in the church, we want authenticity. We want people to be candid and just tell us the truth. We can put up with difficult truths, but I think the conflict for so many comes with feeling that the truth was not given to us. And I think we love to recognize that we're human. I love the idea that my ancestors were human because I can relate to that humanity so much more than I can to the idolized version that we've crafted. And I hope that when I die, my kids and grandkids see me as human, as something relatable to them, as someone who made mistakes, and so on. The second thing I just wanted to add, I think I agree the socio-historical context is really important here. And as I've looked through that for A.O. Smoot, I was curious what he was raised in. We did know he was from the South in a slave-owning family. It was interesting for me to discover, though, after he left Kentucky, his cousins became the founding members of the KKK in Owen County, Kentucky. And they participated in murders, in abuses, and his cousin was convicted of murdering two white abolitionist ministers. So he came from knowing that. It's like, okay, it could have been a lot worse. But also, I think we sometimes, again, wanting sometimes to make them it more palatable, we want to divorce them from, it's like, look, he could just be racist, and that's okay. We can have that conversation, and it's important to have that conversation. We don't need to just sweep this under the rug or say, well, maybe God needed it to do this way for a while, like, which again, I think is where we lose people more than in just being candid about it. Anyway, I'm really grateful for being here. Thank you all for doing this.
Really happy to have you. So thank you for sharing that. LaSonia.
Actually, I'll let Carolyn speak first because I probably have, Carolyn, you speak first.
Okay.
Okay, I will, but well, first of all, thank you so much, Austin. That was I think one of the things you'd like to do as you move through this group is figure out a way to present to other descendants. And I just think you orchestrated that beautifully. And you had as much passion for what you feel is admirable as what you feel were mistakes and really hard things. And I love that balance that you received or that you presented. It was great. Thank you. I just would love to have all of you. What I get stuck on is that there is such a backlash from in our nation right now of talking about truths of the past, and even in some places they've erased the true history of what happened to African Americans. And I just am hoping that in our church that we can have these kinds of discussions. I mean, I know that it does happen. I would love to see the curriculum change. I mean, instead of talking about conference talks every other week, I would love to have something like what Austin just presented to the the Relief Society Elders Quorum. I think that change in the curriculum is really important too, facing the truths, but also changing the curriculum that we use or adding to it. There's a lot of benefit in what we have, and I've benefited and I've appreciated it. But I think that there's a lot more that we could discuss that would help with some of these issues so that it becomes a norm that we talk about race. I mean, it's a norm. It's not looked as woke. It's not, it's just a norm.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. All right, Lasonia, did you want to say
Yeah.
something?
Oh yeah, I have what to say.
Go figure.
So I just want to say, Austin, I am so grateful for what you just shared. It was very powerful and very much so true. The thing that you said, which was very empowering to me, and what I had to do as I worked with, I did the Untold Stories here at One of Quarters. And I'll put this scenario out there and I'll just say it again. I've shared this with Marion and then before, is that you made a comment about, you know, someone in your family having chemo and how their body responded, you know, to that. And so I had a mother that also had cancer, and she had cancer to the point whereas she had a huge wound, you know, and that's the way I compare it to. It was a huge wound in her thigh. It was about the size of a softball because it was a tumor. And when they did that, they couldn't close it. It had to heal from the inside out. But in the process of that healing, we would have to go in and clean it out, you know, because it's like you can't allow a wound to close up and then have the infection, you know, and it closes, you know, so you got to keep it cleaned out, right? So the thing that you talked about, which is not very much spoken, is the saints and a lot of blacks that was in Mississippi are in the down in the South, and then how they moved, and even from Utah, that a lot of people, a lot of things were catered to them in growing Salt Lake and growing various things. And so there's so much about the South. People moved. You talked about Tennessee. We found people, you know, when we did the Untold Stories, Lydia Walker, she was in Tennessee, but really nobody knows any more than a line. We found out that there's some in Iowa. So we know that there were a lot of African Americans, and not only African Americans, but indigenous. And it has so much to do with the erasure. It's erasing. You know, you can't erase people, because if you understand, you know, how Heavenly Father works, right? And we learn this in the scriptures. He names things, you know, he names everything. There's identity, there's belonging, and there's relationship. And you can't cut any of those out because God doesn't cut it out. So if a name and identity is very important to God, it's important. And so a lot of times things that are looked at is more based on policy and not humanity. You know, the way I describe it is that if a bishop, as you say, or if there's a leader that's in the church that has a member that is bleeding in front of them, and they refer to the policy and say, well, you've been here too many times, so I'm gonna leave you to bleed. You know, there's trauma. And if you don't tell the history from the beginning, because history existed before Salt Lake, history existed, you know, you had people that were coming, and it's just like a pond. If you throw a rock in the middle of the pond, it ripples, and it's still rippling. And you can't just expect, not you, I'm not talking about you, but just in general, you can't expect people to just be like, oh yeah, okay, so the restriction. Yes, you took away the restriction, but you didn't heal the wound. And so if the wound is still festering, even though there's no restriction anymore, you have a wound still. The wound hasn't been addressed. The wound is still basically dirty. So, and that's the whole thing. It's like, if we don't understand, it's more than the restriction. That was only the beginning. You know, it's just like trying to do reconciliation, but you don't deal with the history. And maybe you don't know the history, but there are people that are looking at the history. So what you've done is commendable. Talking about the South, is commendable, because when I did the Untold Stories, I discovered the slavery of my family that's down there. And I know that a whole lot of them came from the South and that whole North Carolina, South Carolina border. And they all ended up in Mississippi along with the Trail of Tears. So when the Trail of Tears came, all of them came, a lot of them intermarried. And so a lot of those family members, like you said, bankhead, there's a bankhead in winter quarters that nobody can figure out outside he's a bankhead. Where did he come? Where's the rest of it? We have to know the history. And that doesn't mean a shaming or a guilt. That means that it just needs to be, the erasure has to not be erased anymore. Just like they've erased matriarchs. You know, you can't have a tree growing and cut out the roots. And that's what they've done. You can't cut the roots and expect the tree to still grow. It doesn't. So thank you. I just wanted to say thank you. I have not heard anybody speak the way you just spoke about that. And I thank you, because you're so right. So right.
Thank you so much. Now, I'll say something, but Stephanie, you can speak first. Did you have your hand raised? I thought you'd raised your
Yes,
hand.
I did. Is it still up? Yeah, thank you. I like the way you presented it in the duality. He had good tendencies, good things that you can talk about, but there's that other side. And it seems like with all of us, that's the issue with anybody. I guess from my standpoint is that if we're the Church of Jesus Christ, we must uphold the gospel. We do have this, there's a good side of us, there's a bad side of us, but guess what? We're on eternal progression. Okay? What we did in the past, we can't erase history because we're learning from the past. Okay? And so if we erase it, we're not learning. Okay. The other thing is that in the gospel, we're taught what do we do? The first thing in the step to baptism is repentance. So you got to acknowledge and repent of it. Okay. You can't get over it. You can't progress if you're sweeping it under the rug. And that's a bad thing for the youth, because the youth are falling away from the church, because now it's just like, no, we love all people, but you don't talk about the past. And it's just like, you don't talk about all the dirty underwear under there. And you didn't say, oh, I'm sorry, we did that. Let's get those clothes and wash it out. Let me tell you how that happened. You know what I'm saying? And so with the youth, it's like the church is not even, or some people are not even willing to acknowledge it. Okay. And I'm sorry, this is my soapbox. You can't say we don't know why it happened. You know exactly why it happened. Okay. And it's just like, for me, it's just like, no, we did that. That was a bad thing. But guess what? We have progressed with Jesus and figured out why that was wrong. Because guess what? Jesus didn't change. He said in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, and the Book of Mormon, that he's no respecter of persons. It wasn't open to interpretation. It's who he was. We just had to catch on to it. So I feel for the young people right now, because they're not having enough. There are, like you, Austin, who are bringing this up, and Willie and Carolyn and Marilyn, is just like what you were brought up thinking. You're like, oh, that was so wrong, you know, and you're willing to take those steps to change. But we need more people to take that step to change. And it's like, oh, that was totally wrong, and I'm not on board with that anymore. I'm following Jesus. So I just hope and pray and that we can get more people like you, Austin, and Carolyn and Marilyn and Rachel to speak up and say, hey, yeah, that happened, but hey, we're moving forward and this is how we're going to do it. So, yeah.
I'll say one thing, and then Morgan, I think you had your hand raised. It reminds me of, so this all kind of blew up in 2019. I remember because I reached out to Liam and I was like, dude, have you seen this? And I had a friend talk to me of being like, so like your ancestors are like slaveholders. They're like awful, horrible people. I'm like, yeah, that's awful. Like it's abominable. Like this is so awful. And then she was like, so have you like thought about changing your last name about like something like this? And I remember thinking that just felt like a weird, I think it's a reaction that some people have, but it felt like a weird reaction to me because I'll be quite honest. I led by telling a type of story. Everything in the front part of the story of my ancestor were true and things that I find deeply admirable and inspired by. That hasn't gone away. I think it's just better that we look at a fuller picture. The same thing, look at the entirety of like prophets. Like if you learn about the racial restriction, we know where this came from, the idea that came in, how it seeped in, who introduced it, and then how it got solidified. And so we can learn and say, hey, we don't believe in infallible prophets. Like I think we just need to root out the lessons learned from these awful histories without feeling like we need to run from them and say, hey, if anything, this is a lesson that we can take to our today. Because I think a lot of people are like, just do the right thing, just be an active member, hold your call and do your kind of thing. And I think this is a rude awakening to say, oh no, like every single one of us, we're supposed to be actively rooting out the weeds that are taking hold in the hallways, in the doctrines, in our rhetoric that is grounded in racism or white supremacy or misogyny. We need to actively be, I think we have a much heavier duty than we thought. But I think people are like, oh, there's just so much more. Like our callings are already exhausting. It's incredibly refreshing to have these conversations, to look at the whole picture and the truth and say, hey, I can do something about this. I can make this a better place. I'm in favor. At the time, I was like, I'm in favor of changing the name of the buildings. But quite frankly, BYU is always going to face the problem of naming their buildings after old people, because we're going to take new paradigm shifts and say, oh, this was awful. If anything, we should name our buildings after like virtues, and then just deck the halls with examples of beautiful stories of the charity building or something. And I'm like, dude, and then you can do something like that. And then you can reflect and say, hey, there are admirable things of some people, but most characters are complex. And you will never, ever see me excuse anyone saying, well, slavery was acceptable back then. It is awful and abominable and horrible and is never excusable. They lived in a framework where that was acceptable and they didn't have to scrutinize that, even though it is atrocious. And so, yeah, like I'm like, I still love my last name. I still love my family tree and so many people in it. And there are aspects of the story that I still find inspiring. But I feel more responsibility than ever to say, hey, we need to be vocal. The Smoots should be anti-racist, and we should be at the forefront of saying we've gone down this track before and this causes harm to others. And in today's political climate, we should be actively participating in rooting out harm and whitewashing history and learning from these mistakes that we have. So anyways, that was my example. Morgan, you can share.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe offer a little consolation and comfort from a youth perspective. Maybe I'll acknowledge that I probably just run in all of the right circles as a history student and at Utah State, where I think maybe a lot of people go when they don't want to go to BYU. So they're maybe a little more willing to talk about hard history. But I've had a lot of really great conversations with members of the church who are my age, being really willing to acknowledge this history and kind of be okay straddling both worlds, especially in at a school where I won't say I feel attacked, but people are a little more willing to, you know, be a little more brash. But I just want to say I'm really optimistic. I think that yeah, there is some scariness. There is like, oh yeah, when you learn about these histories that you usually don't learn at a really young age. There is some shock, right, Grammy, and there's some hardness there, but most of the people that I've come in contact with and talked about these things with are really willing um to offer grace and to recognize the nuances and yeah, I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful. I think it's going to go great.
That's encouraging. Thank you, Morgan.
I'm actually really impressed with some of the Morgan, your age group that's coming up. I've seen a lot of really amazing, the capability of holding tension and dealing with hard conversations is much greater than I think has been in the past. And maybe it's just because you have to, because guess what? We're have so much information being thrown at us. What do? You either learn to deal with it or not. And so any other thoughts? I think that was a great conversation. I appreciate everybody's thoughts here. Great presentation. Yeah, Lasonia, we appreciate you coming. I don't know if I need to name this or if you guys, I feel so deeply the presence of goodness here, the spirit here, I guess, in our vernacular. I think that this is the direction that God is needing us to go as individuals. I can't speak for the institutional church, but I think as individuals, our ability to hold this and name it and speak of it is deeply important to both our heavenly parents and our ancestors. I feel that very deeply, and I always have from as we started this, that this is ancestral work, that this is the work that needs to be done. Really relate to the idea that our ancestors, I am sure, want us to fix and learn and grow what has happened in the past. I feel that deeply. So, Lasonia.
I'm sorry. You know, this is a good conversation. I should have been gone already. But I just have to say, I 100% agree with you, Rachel, with that, because, you know, I was just studying something recently and I was thinking about it. You know, we are all God's children and we're supposed to be family. And, you know, and we're supposed to be trying to create a Zion. And, you know, the one thing that Heavenly Father wants is for us to act like family, you know, like family, like if we were up in heaven, you know. And honestly, I just couldn't see him wanting to have us back in that capacity of, because we know that he's not chaos and he's orderly and he's very family and loving. And he wants us to be that way. And so we have to have these conversations so that we can sort this out, because there's nothing wrong with mistakes. I mean, the mistakes are when we cover the mistakes up. It's when we, you know, it's not the fact that you made a mistake. God already knew we were going to make mistakes. He already knew that we were imperfect, but he knew that when it started. So it's just really important to, if we think of each other as family members, like everybody is here, you're a family member. You know, I don't see anybody any different. And I have to say, as Omaha says, when they say they don't see color, it's not a matter of not seeing color. It's the fact that we're brothers and sisters. And as brothers and sisters, we have to respect each other. We have to love each other and we have to talk to one another. And there's nothing wrong with having a good conversation to say, hey, you know what? That hurt. Jesus himself, you good in the scriptures, and what does he say when he's on the mount and they come up there and they say, hey, what's these wounds in your hands? And he doesn't go, oh, your ancestors did this to me. He says, these are the wounds that I got in the house of my friends. He didn't call them out. He didn't do it. And I think if we looked at the Savior and the examples that he set, we would understand that it's important for us to acknowledge wounds. We acknowledge them, but you don't have to be ugly about it. You know, hey, we're friends, we're brothers and sisters. This happened and it hurt.
Thanks, Lasagna.
I'm leaving now. Bye. It was so good talking to y'all.
Thank you. Good to see ya.